requesting a congressional investigation into the facts and circumstances of Jeffrey Epstein's 208 sweetheart deal and recent suicide. And the public is demanding and needs to know what was behind this sentence. Why did this child molester, a prolific child molester, get such a, what we call a slap on the wrist?
We don't know why the local state attorney's office chose not to prosecute Jeffrey Epstein appropriately in light of what was extremely compelling evidence of horrendous crimes that occurred over an extended period of time. This community deserves to know why that choice was made. The public assertion by former Secretary Alex Acosta that this was a weak case that justified the plea deal that was entered into is absolutely and unquestionably false. This was an extremely strong case. There was evidence from multiple victims that corroborated the statements of one another, that were supported by documentary evidence, that were supported by testimony from independent third parties. This was an extremely strong case of horrendous abuse, and there was no reason to enter into the kind of compromise that was entered into in disposing of these charges against Jeffrey Epstein. The federal government has explaining to do about why the non-prosecution agreement immunizing not only Jeffrey Epstein but his co-conspirators was entered into. The evidence that was available to the state was equally available to the federal government. They had continued an investigation beyond the very competent investigation of the Palm Beach Police Department and gathered even more compelling evidence that would have enabled the federal government to obtain a conviction on a 53-page indictment that was drafted and ready to be prosecuted. We need to know why that didn't happen. We need to know why Jeffrey Epstein, when he was sentenced to an extraordinarily lenient plea deal, wound up on work release that permitted him to spend 6 days a week, 12 hours a day at his private office. We need to know why that work release was modified to expressly allow Jeffrey Epstein to spend 2 hours a day in his mansion in Palm Beach as part of his work release program. Why was his door instructed to be left unlocked in his jail cell? Why was a television installed for his private use? Why was Jeffrey Epstein permitted to pay for not jail guards, but private security guards who were instructed that they could not use marked cars and that they could not be in uniform but had to dress in suits? Why was Jeffrey Epstein allowed to, quote, work, unquote, at a job 6 hours a day, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, when he was reportedly fulfilling the same responsibilities, working less than 1 hour a week for this charitable organization that was created expressly for the purpose of justifying his work release? Those are questions that demand answers. And let me be absolutely clear about this. There may be reasonable justification for every one of those things that I have questioned. There may be. However, it's inconceivable to me what those answers might be. We deserve in this community to know those answers.
We want witnesses to come and be answer under oath very, very simple questions that really Mr. Scarola laid out today.
But specifically the former state attorney and,
Yes,
and the
absolutely.
former U.S. attorney?
Absolutely.
And what about the sheriff?
Absolutely. And they're going to be, right, there's going to be other people, you may want to comment on that, because they're not the only people that would have knowledge.
Representative, you have no faith in the state investigation going on right now?
Well,
Is that why you want to do your own?
No, the state investigation, as my understanding, is looking at the sheriff's activity and the work release. There are many other questions that have to be looked at, and we want public testimony, we want transparency, we want an explanation as to how this happened.
The FDLE is investigating potential criminal activity. That's the scope of their responsibility. I'm not suggesting that investigation won't help to provide significant answers, but because it is circumscribed the way it is, because it's limited to the commission of crimes, there may very well be questions that remain unanswered after the FDLE has completed its work.
From the evidence that you have, are you concerned that Barry Krischer was more aligned with Epstein's defense attorneys than with his duties as a prosecutor?
I will tell you that there are serious questions that need to be answered. What I know, as a matter of fact, is this was a very strong criminal criminal case. There was no justification for the kind of plea that was entered based upon an assertion that there was a lack of evidence. There was no lack of evidence. The extent to which the state attorney may have been influenced by Epstein's lawyers is a question that remains unanswered. I will tell you that I've known Barry Krischer for a very long time. I have a great deal of respect for him. I believe him to be a man of honesty and integrity, and it's difficult for me to conceive that he could have been compromised in the performance of his responsibilities. But there are questions that he needs to answer that apparently he alone is able to answer and hasn't yet.
Are you disappointed that he hasn't come forward to at least speak on this issue?
I am disappointed, yeah. And I would hope that there still is time for him to make a choice about coming forward and volunteering information that would help to allay the concerns that the community has about the treatment that Jeffrey Epstein received. I know that the testimony of these child victims corroborated one another. Each of them was telling almost an identical story of how they were recruited, of how they were compensated, of how they were molested, the identity of the people that were involved in that process, and it clearly was not Jeffrey Epstein alone. There were documents that corroborated their stories independently. This was a very strong case.
And I want to add to that I've personally spoken to Chief Ryder over in Palm Beach, who initially brought this investigation to the attention of the state attorney, and he was shocked and disappointed by the outcome.
There was a concerted, extraordinarily well-financed effort to discredit these victims in every way possible. Jeffrey Epstein chose his victims, hoping that if any of them were to ever make accusations against him, he would be in a position to be able to discredit them. That doesn't end the inquiry by any means whatsoever, and that's why the corroboration of multiple victims was so important. That's why the documentary support was so important. That's why the available testimony of those who surrounded Jeffrey Epstein was so important. These were not cases that depended upon the moral character of the children who were being molested. Jeffrey Epstein chose his victims, counting on the fact that he would be able to discredit them if it were necessary to do that. That never should have ended this inquiry under these circumstances. I want to see every co-conspirator of Jeffrey Epstein, everyone who assisted him, everyone who was assisting in recruiting, everyone who was assisting in scheduling, everyone who helped to compensate these children, to induce them to engage in this conduct. I want to see every one of them brought to justice. I want to see them held accountable and answerable for their participation in this terrible criminal enterprise.